So next, let's talk about our drawing tools. So the first tool we're going to go over is the brush tool, which is located on the left side. And the way the brush tool works is if you have a drawing tablet that can detect pressure sensitivity, the lighter you press, the smaller your brush will be, and the harder you press, the thicker your brush will be. And if you want to change the settings on your brush, it's over here on the right under Tool Properties. And if you don't see this window, just go to Windows and Tool Properties. You can also drag these windows around by clicking their tabs and then dragging them to the section you want them to be. If you want to get rid of any of these windows, you can click this X button over here. And if you want to add any windows, you can also click this plus button here and select which window you'd like to add. If your workspace gets all messed up and you want to reset it back to the way it was before, simply go up to Windows and Restore Default Workspace, and it will reset your windows back to their default positions. Another thing to note with Toon Boom Harmony is each brushstroke that you do is like its own object. So if I created a circle with separate brushstrokes, each one of these brushstrokes is its own object. So I can select them and move them around. If you don't like this behavior and you want them to stay connected, we can select our brush tool, go down to our tool properties, and select this auto flatten button. And if I do the same thing, you'll see our shape has now flattened into one object. Another useful thing to know is how to flatten your artwork. So if you draw something with a lot of brushstrokes, sometimes if you have too many brushstrokes, it can really clog up your scene. So a useful thing to do is after you're done drawing your artwork is to take your black arrow tool, select it all, and pressing this flatten button over here, which flattens your artwork into one piece of art instead of several. Or you can also select it and press the hotkey Alt-Shift-F, and that will also flatten your artwork. These other options with your brush tool are Draw Behind and Repaint. So Draw Behind, pretty self-explanatory. Whatever you draw will appear behind whatever has already been drawn on screen. And the Repaint brush will repaint whatever art is already on your drawing canvas. So that's useful for doing colored lines or repainting parts of a character or adding detail without drawing outside the lines. The next drawing tool we're going to go over is the pencil tool, which is right underneath the brush tool. Now you might think these are pretty similar, but I'll explain the differences. So just like with the brush tool, I can go over to my tool properties and I can change the maximum size. But the difference between the pencil tool and the brush tool is the pencil tool doesn't have line weight to it. It all stays the same size no matter how much pressure I use on my tablet. Whereas with the brush, I can vary my size. But the cool thing about Advanced and Premium is you can have pressure sensitivity with the pencil tool, making it a super flexible option. But if we grab our contour editor tool, which is this white arrow, and we select both our brush stroke and our pencil stroke, and zoom in, we can see the difference between the two. So the brush stroke is one solid shape. I can take these lines and move them around, and you can think of this as one filled in solid shape. Whereas with the pencil tool, this is more like a path. So if I move these points, it changes the direction of the path, making it super flexible if you want to change how the direction of your line goes. Whereas if you wanted to change the direction of the brush tool, it's not as easy to do. So that's the main difference between the pencil tool and the brush tool. If I want to get rid of anything, I can just select it and press the delete button. So I'm using my black arrow tool and selecting it and pressing delete. Next we'll go over the eraser tool. Pretty self-explanatory. If I have something drawn on the screen and then I use the eraser tool to erase it, it erases it. And same like the brush tool, if I click on this arrow here to adjust its settings, I can set a minimum size and a maximum size. And that way I get pressure sensitivity, so I can hold down stronger for a big eraser, and then I can use less pressure to get a little more detail with my eraser. Next, we'll talk about the paint bucket tool. So here I have a circle, and I've intentionally left a little bit of a gap here. So sometimes when you're drawing, you might leave little gaps in your artwork. So when you go to use your paint bucket tool to fill it in, you would need to close this gap. And then when you use the paint bucket tool, it'll fill in. But Toon Boom Harmony also has this feature called Close Gap, which is over here in your tool properties. So if I click this button, I can select Close Small Gap, Medium Gap, or Large Gap. We'll just select Close Medium Gap, and we'll select our color and fill it in. And you'll see Toon Boom Harmony has filled it in for us and closed this gap for us. So that's a pretty useful feature. Also, if we hold down our mouse on the paint bucket tool, you'll see all these other paint bucket options. So there's Paint Unpainted, and the way that works is it will fill in any shape that has not been filled in already. So for example, if I take my blue color and I fill in one of these circles with blue, and then I go to my Paint Unpainted tool and I select red and select all of my circles, it will fill in all the colors that have not been filled in already, leaving all my original colors the way they were. This is really useful for quickly filling in an outlined character. Then we have Unpaint, which is similar to selecting a piece of artwork and pressing delete, or you can also select your Unpaint tool and just click areas to unpaint them. We also have these tools called stroke and close gap. So if we select stroke and then draw a shape, we'll get a little message that appears that says you have added a stroke to the drawing, but it will not be visible unless you activate the show strokes from the view menu. So we'll click OK, and it looks like nothing happened. So we're going to follow what that dialog said, and we'll go to View, Show, and Show Strokes, or it's the hotkey of K. And now we have a blue outline showing where our invisible stroke is. And if we press K, it'll disappear, but it's still there. So if I take my arrow tool and I select here, you'll see my stroke is still there, even though I can't see it. So you can think of this as kind of like an invisible drawing tool, and I'll show you how that's useful. So for example, if I have a character's face here, and he's filled in with white, and I take my stroke tool, and I just apply a stroke on him, and since I already know this is happening, that it's not going to be visible, I can select Don't Show Again, and again, it doesn't show, so I'm going to press the hotkey of K so I can see my stroke again. And now what I can do is I can fill in this area with my paint bucket tool with blue. So this is a really easy way to shade your character, is using the invisible stroke tool. And these strokes won't show up, they don't render or anything, so you don't have to worry about them showing up in your final animation. Underneath your paint bucket tool, you have the geometry tools, which are pretty self-explanatory. You have a line, a rectangle, an ellipse tool, and a pen tool, just like in Illustrator. Underneath that is our eyedropper tool. What it does is you can click on any color and it will select that color in your palette window. So I can click on green and it'll select the color green, can click on blue, etc., etc. So those are all the basic drawing tools in Toon Boom Harmony. So next let's talk about the color window. So this is where all your colors are going to go. The nice thing about the way Toon Boom Harmony works is when you fill in a character's color, for example, let's say we filled in a character's shirt with blue, and we changed our mind and we don't want it to be blue throughout the whole animation. In other programs, you'd have to select every frame and repaint it by hand. But in Toon Boom Harmony, we can simply select the blue and change its color, and it'll change across the whole animation. Pretty cool. So the default colors it gives you are pretty limited, so let's add a new color. We'll click the plus to add a new color. We'll see it appears at the bottom here. We'll double click the name to give it a new name, and then to change the color, we'll double click on this box, and our color picker will appear. So by default, it's on RGB color selector, which I don't really find very useful, so I like to select this circle right next to the H, and this color picker probably looks more familiar to you if you've drawn in Photoshop or other programs before. So I can select my hue up here at the top, and I can select my saturation and my value down here. When I've picked a color that I like, I simply close the color picker, and our color has appeared at the bottom here. Let's add another color, and we'll call this one gradient. So if I double click on the gradient to change its color, down here you can see a radial button for solid, but we're going to click on gradient, and you'll see down here is our gradient editor. Each one of these little house shapes is a new color in our gradient. So we're going to select this house shape on the right, and we'll select black, and we'll select the house shape on the left, and we'll select white. And if we want to add a color, we can simply click in between, and it'll add a new shape, and we can select a different color for that one as well. And you can also select whether you want a linear or a radial gradient. You can also change the alpha, which is how transparent your color is. This works on gradient as well as the solid colors. So for example, if I have two black colors on each end and I make one completely transparent and I select radial, let's actually reverse that. So I can reverse that by dragging this house over and this house over so they're on the opposite side. And we've created a little shadow that we can use in our animation. So again, once we're done, we'll click close and we have a new gradient color. So here I have an outline shape and I'm going to fill it in using my paint bucket tool. I'm going to select my gradient and I'll click inside the shape to fill it in. So when you want to edit your gradient, that is under the white arrow tool and edit gradient/texture. So when we select our gradient, we'll see our gradient tool pop up. And I'll zoom out a little bit so you can get a better idea of what's going on. So because we have a radial gradient, we have this circular tool. And just to demonstrate, I'm going to create a second box with a linear gradient. So if I take my gradient editor tool and I select the linear gradient, you'll see the tool looks a bit different. So the way the radial gradient works is the middle is where the center of your gradient is. This handle on the outside rotates your gradient. This corner scales your gradient, and if you want to keep the aspect ratio the same, just simply hold shift and you'll keep it a perfect circle. These side boxes here skew your gradient, and this box, not the circular handle, which is the rotate option, but this box right under it scales the height, and this box to the left scales the width. The linear gradient is a lot more simple. So it has the same center option so you can move your gradient around. It has the same rotation option so you can rotate your gradient, and it has one scale handle that you can scale your gradient with. So that's all the basic drawing options in Toon Boom Harmony. Now that we know how to draw, let's talk about modifying and transforming our drawing. So when you have a drawing, you want to be able to edit it. So there's a couple of tools at our disposal to edit our drawings. The first is our black arrow tool, which we've been using to select artwork, but it can do a lot more as well. You may notice that when you select something, there's a transformation box around whatever you select. If we grab a corner, this will scale our object. And if we wanted to keep the aspect ratio the same, we simply hold Shift. If we move slightly away from the corner of the box, you'll see our cursor changes to a rotation tool. So now I can rotate my artwork. If we drag an edge like this is how we skew our artwork. You'll also notice a dot in the middle. This is our pivot point. So if I were to move it and then go back to rotate, you'll see it rotates around that pivot point that we just moved. Also, a neat feature of Toon Boom Harmony is if I rotate my canvas, my transform tool will match whatever angle my canvas is rotated on. This makes it super simple to really get a squash and stretch from a specific angle. The next tool we'll talk about is this white arrow tool, or our contour editor. And what this is for editing nodes along a path. So if we select our artwork, we can see the individual nodes that actually make up the art. If we click and drag on one of these points, we can move it around. We can also drag and move these Bezier handles around to change the angle of the curve. And if we hold Alt and click on a point, that will remove the Bezier handles, making it into a sharp corner. If we hold Alt and drag, we can add those Bezier points back in. If I just want to move one of these Bezier handles, holding Alt will also just move one side of the Bezier handle. So after doing that, this handle is now independent from the other handle, so I can get shapes like that. If I want to reset them back to be connected again, all I do is rotate them until the angles match up again. So now you'll see that my Bezier handles are now linked up again. If we hold down Control or Command on a Mac, we can click and add points along a path. To delete points, simply select them with the white arrow tool and press Delete. Next is our Cutter tool, which is located under the black arrow tool. This is probably one of the most useful tools in Toon Boom Harmony for editing artwork. So let's say you wanted to cut a piece of pie out of this circle character here. If I were to do that with my black arrow tool, remember it's selecting each brushstroke as its own object. So if I do that, what it's actually doing is just selecting the whole brushstroke, and that's not what we want. So we'll click and hold, grab our Cutter tool, select a piece of pie, and press Delete. So that's how you delete specific sections of a piece of artwork. You can also use the Cutter tool to remove excess brush strokes. So if I were to select my Cutter tool, select this extra bit right here, it'll just select that extra bit and I can press Delete to get rid of it. Or an even faster way is to use this mouse gesture mode, which is this button right here. If that's on, all I have to do is draw a line right through the extra that I want to get rid of, and it'll get rid of it for me. A super quick way to get rid of extra lines. And that's it. Those are your basic editing tools for editing artwork in Toon Boom Harmony. In the next section, we will talk about how to get started animating.